The moment people stop talking when you walk into a room, you learn more by staying quiet than by asking questions. I did not understand how true that was until after my husband died. My name is Eleanor Whitmore. I was 71 years old when I buried the man I had loved for 46 years. Frank and I built a life together in a white two-story house at the end of a quiet street in Ohio. We raised a son there, celebrated birthdays there, survived hard years there. I always believed that after losing Frank, my family would pull closer together. Instead, something else happened. 3 days after the funeral, I walked into my own kitchen and watched my son Daniel and his wife Rachel suddenly stop talking. They were standing near the island with coffee mugs in their hands. The silence arrived so quickly it felt unnatural. Rachel looked down at the counter. Daniel cleared his throat and asked whether I wanted more coffee. The conversation changed immediately. At the time, I told myself grief was making me imagine things. But then it happened again and again. A week later, I stepped into the living room and found Rachel scrolling through something on her tablet. The moment she noticed me, the screen went dark. She smiled and asked how I was feeling. The question sounded caring. The timing did not. Little things started adding up. Phone calls ended when I entered a room. Conversations shifted directions. Daniel began avoiding simple questions. Whenever I mentioned Frank, both of them seemed eager to talk about the future instead. The future? I was still trying to survive the present. One afternoon, I sat alone in Frank's study. His favorite chair remained beside the window. A pair of reading glasses rested on the desk exactly where he left them. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and old books. I remember running my hand across the desk and wishing I could hear his voice one more time. Frank had always noticed things other people missed. He used to tell me that people reveal themselves in small moments. Not during speeches, not during celebrations, during ordinary days when they think nobody is paying attention. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. Now I wondered if he had meant something more. A few days later, I noticed the first thing that truly unsettled me. A blue file folder was missing from the corner of Frank's desk. I knew it had been there because I dusted around it every week. At first, I assumed I had moved it myself. I searched every drawer, every shelf, every cabinet in the study. Nothing. The folder was gone. When I asked Daniel if he had seen it, he hesitated for a second too long before answering. No, Mom. Maybe Dad moved it somewhere. Dad. Frank had been gone for nearly 2 weeks. Daniel knew that folder had not moved itself, yet he would not meet my eyes. That evening, I sat on the back porch alone. Frank's chair remained empty beside mine. The sun was setting behind the trees when I looked through the kitchen window and saw Rachel speaking quietly to Daniel. Then she pointed toward Frank's study. And for the first time since the funeral, I stopped wondering whether something was wrong. I knew it was. After that evening on the porch, I stopped asking questions. Questions invite explanations. Explanations invite lies. Instead, I started paying attention. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. For more than 40 years, Frank and I had started our mornings together. He always made the coffee. I always watered the flowers on the porch. Even after all those years, we never argued about who did what. We simply fell into a rhythm that felt permanent. Now the coffee maker sounded too loud in the quiet kitchen. I poured a cup and sat in Frank's chair at the dining room table. For a moment, I forgot he was gone. Then I looked across the room and remembered. Grief is strange that way. It hides for a second and then finds you again. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel stopped by. He said he wanted to check on me. The words sounded right, but something about his behavior felt different. While I made sandwiches, his eyes wandered toward the hallway that led to Frank's study. Twice, I caught him glancing in that direction. When I asked whether something was wrong, he smiled too quickly. Just thinking about Dad, he said. I nodded and let the moment pass. Later that afternoon, I decided to organize some old paperwork. Frank had always kept everything neatly labeled. Tax records, insurance forms, property documents. I opened drawer after drawer, trying to locate the missing blue folder. Halfway through the search, I noticed something else. A stack of files had been rearranged. Not dramatically, just enough that someone familiar with the desk would notice. Frank never changed his filing system. Neither did I. Yet several folders had clearly been moved. That evening, Rachel called. She asked if I had considered looking at retirement communities. I nearly laughed. Frank had been gone less than 3 weeks. I had not even decided what to do with his clothes yet. I am doing fine where I am, I replied. There was a pause on the line. A brief one, but long enough. Of course, she said. I just thought it might be easier. Easier. Everyone suddenly seemed concerned with making things easier. Easier for whom remained unclear. 2 days later, I found myself at Daniel and Rachel's house for Sunday dinner. The meal was pleasant enough. We talked about weather, neighbors, and local news. Then Rachel's phone rang. She looked at the screen and immediately stood up. I need to take this, she said. She walked into the next room. A few moments later, Daniel's phone vibrated as well. He looked down, read something, and followed her. Neither realized the kitchen door remained slightly open. I could not hear every word. Only fragments. Not yet. The study. After the paperwork. Then silence. When they returned, both smiled as though nothing had happened. I smiled back. On the drive home, I thought about Frank. Years earlier, he once told me that secrets are difficult to carry. Eventually, people leave little pieces of them behind. A sentence. A glance. A missing folder. I was beginning to collect quite a few pieces. That night, I walked into Frank's study one more time. The room looked exactly as it had before. Almost. Then I noticed something tucked beneath the corner of his desk blotter. It was a folded yellow note written entirely in Frank's handwriting. And after reading the first sentence, I understood why someone might have been searching. His office. For several seconds, I simply stared at the yellow note in my hands. The paper was folded twice and tucked so carefully beneath the desk blotter that it would have remained hidden if I had not noticed the corner sticking out. I unfolded it slowly. The handwriting belonged to Frank. There was no doubt about that. The first sentence immediately made my pulse quicken. Ellie, if you found this note, trust your instincts. I sat down in his chair and kept reading. Frank wrote that during the year before his death, he had begun noticing things that did not quite make sense. Small things. Conversations that changed when he entered a room. Questions that seemed harmless at first, but became repetitive over time. According to him, people often reveal their priorities without realizing it. They reveal them through curiosity, through assumptions, through what they think belongs to them before it actually does. I read every word twice. Near the bottom of the note, Frank mentioned a locked drawer in the filing cabinet beside his desk. My eyes immediately moved toward the cabinet. The drawer was one I rarely opened because Frank always handled those records himself. For a moment, I hesitated. Then I stood and walked across the room. The key was exactly where he said it would be, taped beneath the back corner of a shelf. My hands trembled slightly as I unlocked the drawer. Inside sat several folders. Most contained ordinary paperwork. Insurance records. Property tax documents. Bank statements. Then I noticed a smaller folder with a handwritten label. Observations. The word alone made my stomach tighten. I carried the folder back to the desk and opened it carefully. Inside were several pages of notes written over many months. Nothing dramatic. Nothing emotional. Just observations. Dates. Conversations. Questions. One page described a family barbecue where Rachel repeatedly asked about the value of homes in our neighborhood. Another described a holiday dinner where Daniel wanted to understand how property transfers worked after a spouse passed away. Reading the notes felt strange. None of the conversations seemed alarming on their own. Yet when placed together, they created a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Then I reached an entry written only 6 months before Frank died. According to his notes, Rachel had commented that maintaining a large house in retirement was unrealistic. She suggested that simplifying things early would prevent future complications. At the time, Frank apparently smiled and changed the subject. But later that evening, he wrote a single sentence beneath the entry. She talks about the future as though certain decisions have already been made. I leaned back in the chair and stared out the study window. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the backyard. For a moment, I remembered all the evenings Frank and I spent there together. Then another thought entered my mind. Rachel was not the only name appearing in the notes. Daniel appeared more often than I expected. Not as frequently, not as aggressively, but enough. The realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. Just then, my phone vibrated on the desk. It was a message from Daniel. He wanted to stop by that evening. Said he needed to discuss something important. I looked down at the folder in front of me. Then I looked at the message. For the first time since finding the note, I had a feeling I already knew what the conversation was going to be about. Daniel arrived just after 6 o'clock that evening. I saw his truck pull into the driveway from the kitchen window while I was preparing dinner. For a moment, I found myself remembering a much younger version of him. A little boy running through the yard with scraped knees and grass stains on his jeans. A teenager carrying baseball equipment through the front door after practice. A college graduate standing proudly beside his father for photographs. It is difficult to reconcile those memories with the person sitting across from you years later. When he stepped inside, he looked nervous. Not frightened. Not upset. Just uncomfortable. The way people look when they have rehearsed a conversation in their minds too many times. We sat at the kitchen table. The same table where Frank and I shared thousands of meals over the years. For several minutes, Daniel talked about ordinary things. Work, traffic, the weather. None of it mattered. Eventually, he cleared his throat and leaned forward. "Mom," he said carefully, "have you thought any more about the house?" There it was. The question I had been expecting. I took a sip of coffee before answering. "Not really." Daniel nodded slowly. "Rachel and I have been talking." I almost smiled. "Rachel and I have been talking." It seemed those words appeared before every conversation I did not want to have. "About what?" I asked. He hesitated. "About what makes the most sense moving forward." Moving forward. Another phrase that had become strangely popular since Frank's funeral. Daniel explained that the house was large, expensive to maintain, full of stairs. He talked about convenience, simplicity, practicality. Every argument sounded reasonable on the surface. Yet something about the conversation felt wrong. Not because of what he said, because of how quickly he was saying it. Frank had been gone less than a month. I had not even finished sorting through his clothes. The workshop still looked exactly as he left it. His reading glasses still sat beside his favorite chair. Yet Daniel was already discussing major life changes. While he spoke, I remembered the folder hidden in Frank's desk. I remembered the notes, the observations, the concerns. Suddenly, every word carried a different weight. Then Daniel said something that made me pay even closer attention. "Rachel found a few communities you might like." Communities. Not homes. Not options. Communities. The kind of place people suggest when they have already imagined you living somewhere else. I nodded politely and changed the subject. A few minutes later, Rachel arrived to join us. She carried dessert and a bright smile. Within 10 minutes, she somehow managed to bring the conversation back to housing. Again, she talked about convenience, new opportunities, less maintenance. Then she made a mistake. A small one. The kind people make when they become too comfortable. "The house would probably attract strong offers in today's market," she said. Daniel immediately looked at her. The room went quiet for half a second. Then Rachel smiled and added, "I mean, someday, whenever Eleanor is ready." Eleanor. Not Mom. Not even Mrs. Whitmore. Just Eleanor. I smiled politely and pretended not to notice. But I did notice. I noticed everything. Later that night, after they left, I returned to Frank's study and opened the folder again. As I flipped through the pages, a loose sheet slipped free and landed on the desk. It was not one of Frank's observation notes. It was something else entirely. At the top of the page was a name I recognized immediately. James Callahan, Frank's attorney. And beside it, written in Frank's handwriting, were 5 words that instantly caught my attention. "Call him if patterns continue." The next morning, I called James Callahan. The number still worked. When he answered, I introduced myself and explained who I was. There was a brief silence on the line before he responded. "Eleanor," he said gently, "I wondered if I might hear from you someday." That single sentence was enough to make me sit down. We arranged to meet later that afternoon at his office downtown. The building was older than I expected. Brick exterior, tall windows, polished wood floors. The kind of place that felt untouched by time. James greeted me personally and led me into a private conference room. He looked to be in his early 60s, calm and professional. More importantly, he already seemed to know why I was there. After I showed him the note from Frank's desk, he nodded slowly. "Your husband asked me to keep certain records available if you ever contacted me." My pulse quickened. "What kind of records?" James opened a folder and carefully placed several documents on the table. To my surprise, none of them involved secret accounts or hidden fortunes. Instead, they contained notes from meetings Frank had requested during the final year of his life. Notes about protecting me. Notes about preserving my ability to make my own decisions. Notes about preventing outside pressure after his passing. As I read, one sentence stood out above all the others. Frank had written, "If Eleanor begins noticing patterns, tell her to trust herself." I stared at the page for several seconds. Trust herself. For weeks I had questioned my own Instincts. I had wondered whether grief was making me suspicious, whether loneliness was making me imagine problems that did not exist. Reading those words felt like hearing Frank speak directly to me. James continued, "Your husband was not worried about money," he explained. "He was worried about influence." Influence. The word lingered in my mind during the drive home. That evening, I decided to stop by Daniel and Rachel's house without calling first. I had borrowed a serving dish weeks earlier and finally had an excuse to return it. As I approached the front porch, I noticed voices coming from the open kitchen window. Normally, I would have announced myself immediately. Instead, I slowed my steps. Rachel was speaking. "The sooner everything is settled, the sooner we can move on with our lives." Daniel replied, but I could not hear every word. Then Rachel spoke again. "I am tired of waiting. We cannot keep putting our plans on hold." My stomach tightened. Plans. There was that word again. Suddenly, I understood why she had been showing Daniel photographs of lake houses and new vehicles. Why she kept talking about retirement communities. Why every conversation somehow led back to my future. In her mind, my future had already become part of hers. I stepped back from the window and waited a full minute before walking to the front door and ringing the bell. When Rachel opened it, her expression changed instantly. Friendly. Warm. Perfect. "Eleanor," she said with a smile, "what a surprise." I smiled back and handed her the serving dish. During the next 20 minutes, she behaved exactly as she always did. Polite, helpful, thoughtful. Yet now I had heard the version of her that appeared when she thought nobody was listening. On the drive home, I realized something important. I no longer needed proof that something was wrong. I already had that. What I needed now was patience. Because people who believe they are getting away with something eventually become careless. And as I pulled into my driveway, I noticed a large envelope sticking out of my mailbox addressed in Frank's handwriting. For a moment, I simply stood beside the mailbox staring at the envelope. The handwriting belonged to Frank. There was no doubt about that. I had seen it for nearly half a century. Even from a distance, I would have recognized the careful way he formed each letter. My pulse quickened as I carried the envelope into the house. The evening sun was beginning to fade, casting long shadows across the living room. I sat down at the kitchen table and placed the envelope in front of me. For several seconds, I could not bring myself to open it. Something about seeing Frank's handwriting again made the loss feel fresh, as though he had only been gone for a few days instead of several weeks. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter and a smaller packet of documents. I unfolded the letter first. "Ellie," it began, "if this reaches you, then you have started noticing the same things I noticed." I immediately felt a lump form in my throat. Frank explained that during the last year of his life, he became increasingly concerned about how often certain conversations focused on property, inheritance, and future ownership. He never accused anyone of bad intentions. Instead, he paid attention. He listened. He observed, just as he always had. Then came a sentence that stayed with me. "People reveal themselves when they start treating tomorrow like it already belongs to them." I read that line twice, then a third time. Suddenly, Rachel's comments about retirement communities, the conversations about downsizing, the missing folder, the lake house photographs, all of it felt connected. Frank continued by explaining that he wanted me to remember something important. Observation is not suspicion. Observation is simply seeing what is already there. For weeks, I had worried that grief was making me imagine problems. Now I realized Frank had seen many of the same patterns long before I did. The packet attached to the letter contained several documents. Most were routine records, property information, trust paperwork, estate planning notes. Then I found a page with James Callahan's name at the top. Beneath it was a handwritten instruction from Frank. "If Eleanor becomes concerned, schedule a family meeting." Family meeting. The words immediately caught my attention. Frank rarely wrote anything without a reason. I picked up the phone and called James. He answered on the second ring. After I explained what I had found, there was a brief pause. "I think your husband expected this possibility," he said quietly. We agreed to meet the following day. After the call ended, I carried the letter into Frank's study and sat in his chair. The room remained exactly as he left it. The same books, the same lamp, the same framed photographs. For a moment, I closed my eyes and imagined him sitting across from me, not speaking, just watching, the way he always did when he wanted someone to reach their own conclusion. The next afternoon, I met James again. This time, the conversation was brief. He reviewed the documents and nodded. Then he told me something that changed everything. Your husband requested that a formal family meeting be held if certain patterns emerged after his passing. I already knew my answer before he finished speaking. Schedule it, I said. James nodded. Daniel and Rachel will need to attend. As I left his office, I felt strangely calm. Not because I knew what would happen next. Because for the first time since Frank's funeral, I understood exactly what I needed to do. I was going to stop asking questions. I was going to keep watching. And sooner or later, the truth was going to walk into the room all by itself. The family meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday morning. During the days leading up to it, I noticed something interesting. The less I said, the more comfortable Daniel and Rachel became. Silence has a strange effect on people. They often mistake it for agreement. Rachel certainly did. She called several times that week, always sounding cheerful and optimistic. She spoke about future plans as though they were already settled. One afternoon, she invited me to lunch at a restaurant overlooking the river. I accepted. For the first 15 minutes, she talked about ordinary things. Then the conversation slowly drifted toward housing. A fresh start can be healthy, she said while stirring her iced tea. Sometimes people stay attached to places because of memories. I nodded politely. Memories matter. Rachel smiled. Of course they do. But eventually, everyone has to move forward. There was that phrase again. Move forward. I had heard it so often that it no longer sounded accidental. Later in the meal, she pulled out her phone and began showing me photographs. At first, I assumed they were vacation pictures. Instead, I found myself looking at a beautiful lakefront property. Large windows overlooked the water. A private dock stretched into the lake. Rachel smiled as she swiped through the images. Isn't it beautiful? She asked. I agreed that it was. Then she added something that caught my attention. Daniel loves it too. The way she said it was not hopeful. It was confident, as though she already expected certain doors to open. 2 days later, Daniel stopped by the house. He looked tired, more tired than usual. While we talked, I noticed him staring at Frank's study several times. The confidence he displayed weeks earlier was gone. Something was bothering him. Yet whenever I asked whether everything was all right, he insisted that it was. That evening, after he left, I sat alone in the study. Frank's notes remained spread across the desk. His observations, his concerns, his reminders. One sentence stood out again. People reveal themselves when they think nobody is looking. The following afternoon, I received another call from Rachel. She sounded excited. The meeting should clear everything up, she said. Once everyone understands the situation, we can finally make decisions. Decisions, not possibilities, not discussions. Decisions. After we ended the call, I sat quietly on the back porch and watched the sunset settle across the yard. Frank's empty chair sat beside mine. The roses he planted years ago were beginning to bloom. Looking at them, I realized how much he had understood about people. He never told me what to think. He simply taught me how to watch. The night before the meeting, I could not sleep. Around midnight, I walked downstairs and made coffee. The house was silent. As I passed through the living room, I glanced toward a framed photograph of Frank and me taken during our 40th anniversary trip. For a moment, I smiled. Then I remembered the meeting waiting for us the next morning. Rachel believed she was walking into a conversation that would confirm everything she expected. Daniel believed the future was simply a matter of paperwork. Neither of them understood that Frank had spent months preparing for this exact moment. And as I finally turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I realized something else. The truth no longer felt hidden. It felt patient, waiting quietly for everyone to gather in the same room. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray. The drive to James Callahan's office felt strangely peaceful. For weeks, I had been collecting pieces of a puzzle without knowing exactly what picture they would form. Now, for the first time, I felt as though the waiting was over. When I arrived, James greeted me in the lobby and escorted me to a conference room overlooking the courthouse square. A few minutes later, Daniel and Rachel walked in together. Rachel wore a confident smile. Daniel looked tired. The difference between them was impossible to miss. Rachel seemed eager for the meeting to begin. Daniel seemed uncertain about where it might lead. We exchanged polite greetings and took our seats. James opened a folder and began reviewing standard estate matters. Property records, administrative procedures, routine information. Rachel listened carefully and occasionally nodded. Several times, she exchanged brief glances with Daniel. The confidence I had seen during lunch by the river was still there. Then James reached for a separate folder. The atmosphere in the room changed immediately. There are additional instructions Frank Whitmore requested that I review under specific circumstances, he said. Rachel's smile faded slightly. Daniel leaned forward. James continued. He explained that several months before his death, Frank had established legal protections intended to ensure that I retained complete control over my future decisions. Any major changes involving the house required my direct approval. Any decisions regarding property ownership remained subject to my authority. The language was clear, straightforward, unambiguous. For the first time that morning, Rachel spoke. I thought those matters would automatically move through the estate process. James nodded politely. Certain matters will eventually move through the estate process. However, Mrs. Whitmore retains full authority over the residence. The room fell silent. Rachel opened her mouth as though she wanted to continue the discussion. Then she stopped. There was nothing to argue with. The documents spoke for themselves. James continued reviewing additional instructions Frank had left behind. Every page reinforced the same message. Frank wanted me protected. Frank wanted me secure. Frank wanted me free to make my own decisions without pressure from anyone. As the meeting continued, I noticed something happening to Daniel. The confidence he carried after the funeral had disappeared completely. He looked down at the table more often than he looked at anyone else. For the first time, I wondered whether he was finally seeing the situation through a different lens. Then James reached the final section of the file. Your husband also included a personal statement, he said. He adjusted his glasses and began reading. Frank wrote that a family home should never be treated as an opportunity. A home represented years of sacrifice, memories, and shared life. He hoped that after his passing, every decision would be guided by compassion rather than convenience. Hearing those words felt like hearing Frank speak one last time. The room remained silent after James finished reading. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Finally, Daniel looked toward me. Mom, he said quietly, I did not know any of this. I believed part of what he was saying. Maybe not all of it, but part of it. Before the conversation could continue, James reached into his briefcase and removed a sealed envelope. The moment I saw Frank's handwriting across the front, my heart tightened. James carefully placed it on the table. There is one final letter, he said. Your husband instructed me to read it only after everything else had been explained. Rachel stared at the envelope. Daniel looked confused. I felt the room grow very still. Then James broke the seal, unfolded the pages inside, and quietly said the words that changed. Everything. This letter is addressed to all three of you. James unfolded the letter carefully and began reading. The room became so quiet that I could hear the faint ticking of a clock somewhere beyond the conference room wall. The first sentence sounded exactly like Frank. If you are hearing this letter, then I am no longer there to say these things myself. My throat tightened immediately. James continued. Frank wrote that throughout his life he had learned something simple but important. People reveal their priorities through what they pay attention to. Some people pay attention to relationships. Some pay attention to responsibilities. Others pay attention to opportunities. He explained that he never believed character was revealed during good times. Character revealed itself when people thought nobody was watching. Then came the part that changed everything. Frank addressed Daniel directly. Son, your responsibility was never to inherit your mother's home. Your responsibility was to protect your mother inside it. The room fell completely silent. Daniel lowered his eyes. For several seconds, nobody moved. James continued reading. Frank wrote that grief makes people vulnerable. Widows deserve patience. They deserve respect. Most importantly, they deserve time. Time to think. Time to heal. Time to decide for themselves what comes next. He hoped nobody would mistake grief for weakness. Then he addressed Rachel. Not with anger. Not with accusations. Simply with honesty. He wrote that a family home should never be viewed as a project waiting for new ownership. A home represents years of sacrifice, memories, and love. It should be treated accordingly. I noticed Rachel staring down at the table. The confidence she carried into the room had disappeared. There were no arguments. No explanations. No attempts to redirect the conversation. Only silence. Finally, James reached the last page. Frank ended the letter with a sentence that immediately brought tears to my eyes. Ellie has always noticed more than people realize. If she becomes quiet, do not assume she is unaware. Assume she is paying attention. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then James carefully folded the letter and placed it back inside the envelope. The meeting was over. The truth no longer needed anyone to explain it. It was sitting in the middle of the table for everyone to see. Eventually, Daniel looked toward me. His voice was softer than I had heard in weeks. "Mom," he said quietly, "I should have listened. I should have paid more attention." I held his gaze for several seconds. Then I nodded. "You should have." The words were not angry. They did not need to be. Daniel looked away. He understood. A few moments later, I added something else. Some mistakes cost more than money. Nobody disagreed. Rachel remained silent. For the first time since Frank's funeral, there was nothing left to say. A few minutes later, we stood and left the conference room. Outside, the afternoon sun had broken through the clouds. People walked through the courthouse square carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued exactly as it always had. Yet something felt different. The uncertainty was gone. The confusion was gone. Several months later, I still live in the same house Frank and I shared for nearly half a century. His study remains exactly where he left it. The roses he planted bloom every spring. Every morning, I carry a cup of coffee onto the back porch and sit beside the empty chair that will always belong to him. I still miss him. I always will. But Frank left me something more valuable than paperwork or property. He left me clarity. He left me dignity. Most importantly, he left me the truth. My family forgot one thing about me. They thought grief had made me blind. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought I was too heartbroken to notice what was happening around me. They were wrong. I was paying attention all along.